over our user interface. But popular these days is another feature that we keep unchecking known as storyboards. Anyone familiar with these yet? Use storyboards. If we check that, what we get out of the box? So this is Apple's way of trying to simplify the user interface process further, at least for applications that follow some common iOS paradigms, like the table view that we just saw, the utility application that we just saw, and making it less necessary to write code to somehow make view controllers interact. So if we follow this next screen by clicking Next with View Storyboards, what we'll get is an application that looks a bit like this. And let me go ahead and open up a different project called Storyboard from tonight's code, and this will give us a view of exactly what's different. In the Storyboard folder, the story begins as usual with main.m, and then up here we seem to have main view controller and flip side view controller. So what I've done was start with which template as a starting point apparently? So the utility application, and a couple of you did this, I think, accidentally, maybe last week when following along, since it was pointed out that your nib file looked a little different, or your UI looked a little different. And indeed, if we go to main storyboard.storyboard, we see a user interface that looks like this for a utility application, and it appears that we're seeing like two nibs simultaneously, the main view controller and the flip side view controller's UI in the same screen. But they're somehow connected via this transition, generally known as a segue. And indeed, that's what it is, because when you use a storyboard, you essentially get one master file for your user interface, and you wire this up all within itself. And you specify in code exactly what you want to happen when A segues to B. So the one line of code we need to draw attention to really is just this. If I go into my main view controller, notice that this is actually pretty straightforward. I've simply implemented a separate method this time called prepare for segue sender. And this is the method that's apparently going to be called whenever the user induces a transition from the first controller to the second controller. And you can see what it's doing here. If segue identifier is equal to the string, quote unquote, show alternate. So this string, show alternate, is completely arbitrary. It could have been foo, bar, baz, whatever. But it's a string that we'll see elsewhere. And apparently what's happening, if that is the identifier of the segue that the user wants to happen by having interacted with the application, we are going to call destination view controller on the segue set delegate to self. In other words, before the user transitions from this side to this side, we apparently want to inform the segue that the destination is going to be what, ultimately? Or rather, we want to inform the destination view controller that its delegate is going to be self, the main side. So recall the same paradigm in the utility application we played with in class that you've probably begun with for Evil Hangman or about to, whereby when you click that done button, you want the transition to go back, and you need to know to whom to return control, in this case, the main view controller. So that begs the question, where is this quoted string coming from? Where is this identifier for the segue? So if we go to the storyboard and I click on the segue itself, not much happens over here, but notice that this is apparently of type modal segue from button to flip side view controller. That's the English friendly string. I'm going to have to make my UI a bit of a mess and open up over here the right-hand panel. And with that segue selected, if I go up here to the attributes inspector, notice that the programmer who made this template, in this case at Apple, manually typed in an identifier of show alternate. But again, that could have been foo, bar, any string there. And that's to uniquely identify that transition. So in short, if we want to somehow wire together the user interface in this different paradigm, whereby both sides of the application are in one file, we simply have to define what happens when that transition occurs. So I mention these now because if you want to take things further, say for your own native application, if you go that route for the third, you'll find that this is a very common paradigm now with iOS programming, because it really eliminates a lot more of the wiring that you need to do, and it centralizes the UI in one place. And as this picture kind of suggests, if you have a particularly complex UI, like a menu and then a submenu and other submenus and other submenus, you can wire them all together within the confines of the same tool. And it's just a simplification. Yeah?
Is there a disadvantage of wiring like the information to the second page and then going back to the first page?
Good question. Is there a disadvantage? Not really. The gripe people tend to have with Interface Builder or using nibs or storyboards in this way is that you don't have as much low-level control, and you can't necessarily sometimes takes more steps to implement than you want. And once you start having to write code to talk to your nib files and whatnot, at that point a lot of people feel, I'll just do it all from scratch. And so that's why we just saw in the master view, the master detail application, the master was all code, even though the detail used a bit of wiring, and the no nib example last week was just all code. So it's just a trade-off, and a lot of people, seasoned iOS developers, tend to prefer just doing things from scratch. And of course, if you're bored with iOS's built-in UI and aesthetics, you have to do it from scratch if you want to layer things on top. Good question. All right, so let's start something truly from scratch now. And based on time, we can pull a pre-baked cake out of the oven, namely implementing an automated teller machine, so a cash machine, a bank machine, that simulates the idea of depositing money into a bank account and actually doing some math to keep track of a total account balance. So let me go ahead and create a new project. We'll do this as a single view application just to keep the focus now on the logic and less on details like the transitions between scenes. And let's go ahead and start. I'll call this ATM. I'm not going to use storyboards. I'm going to use the lower level nib approach, especially since we only need one anyway. I'm going to go ahead and click Next, save it on my desktop. And now I get our standard files over here on the top left. We could tell the story as before, but it's probably getting a little redundant now. Main.m somehow invokes the app delegate, somehow invokes the view controller, and the UI for the view controller comes from the nib. So let's go ahead and create a little bit of an interface here for my ATM. So I'm going to go ahead and make my whole background white just because. And then let's see. I want my ATM to look more like maybe a calculator with a total input field up here, maybe a total account balance down here, and then a whole bunch of numbers. So let's start to wire this up. I'm going to go ahead and have a UI label up top here. I'm going to drag it to be as wide as is recommended. Let me go ahead and increase that font size to make it, let's say 36. Okay, now we'll go ahead and make it a little bigger. And now let me go ahead and do another label that's down here toward the bottom. This is going to be my, actually, let's just copy and paste this so we get the same font size more quickly. I'm going to go down here. This will be my balance. All right, and now I need a whole bunch of buttons to represent this thing. So I'm going to go into my rounded rect button here. And let's see, this will be the number, let's see, let's go ahead and match this lest we get it backwards. Let's go in to save time to the ATM, Xcode project, and ... so that we don't spend all day dragging and dropping. Voila. Now I have this interface. So what's now on the screen? Well, I right-aligned the text. So just by clicking in the Attributes Inspector, I centered this field here, and I added another UI label just to say balance, just for user interface. So there's one label, two labels, three labels. So these aren't input text fields per se, but they're sort of output displays. So in my code, I can display what the user's typing here, and I can display what the user has in their account down here. All right, so what might I want to do next? Well, the goal is I want the user to be able to type in like 50 deposit in order to deposit $50 in his or her account, and then I want to see 50 down here. And if I then do 10 deposit, I want to see a total account balance of 60 down here. So we somehow need to represent a few things that are going on here. One, all of these buttons need to be somehow connected to my code so that when I push the number 5 and then the number 0, a couple of things happen. One, those numbers get saved in RAM somewhere. Two, they display like a calculator would, 5, 0 up here. So I somehow need my code to talk to my interface, which is going to require a IB. In this case, if I want my code to talk to the UI, an IB outlet in that direction. By contrast, when I push a button, I want to trigger an IB action to my code. So I have some blue lines going in both directions, or we can do it purely in code as we've seen. And then I have two special buttons, deposit, of course, and then the clear button. So before we get there, I'm going to go ahead and propose, let me roll back in time. So here's where we were a moment ago, and let's assume that we're seeing now the cake being made, and then finally we'll skip to the ending here. So as we're making this thing, I've realized in the top left that this is an opportunity to have a model, the M in MVC, because this is like a mechanical machine or a digital machine that somehow has to store account balances. So what might I want to model in this program? Well, maybe the notion of an account. In fact, an account, like a bank account, could be modeled pretty well as an object or an instantiation of some class. And inside of an account is going to be one or more pieces of data. And the only one I'm going to care about for now is the account balance. So in order to do this, I'm going to go up to an option that we probably haven't used, but it's pretty straightforward. File, New File. So not a new project, just create a new file. And you'll see an interface that looks a little overwhelming at first because there's a lot of options, but really they're just different templates via which to start a new file. And all I'm going to want is an Objective-C class. So I'm going to